Just like many old stories, this one began with a picture, a small discovery, a simple photo tucked away in the yellow pages of an old leather book, left behind on a dusty shelf in a storage area at London's Victoria and Albert Museum. No one could have known that this image would become more disturbing than anything they had ever found. Dr. Margaret Murray, who worked with old family pictures from the 1800s, came across it while sorting through donated things from someone's private collection. The collection used to belong to Dr. William Acton, a Victorian doctor who enjoyed collecting old items. When she first looked at it, the photograph seemed normal for that time period. 5 serious children, dressed in their finest clothes, standing near each other in a straight row. But when Margaret flipped the page and saw the faded image, something made her stop. The handwritten words under the picture read, Whitechapel 1901, 5 children. That's exactly what it showed. 5 kids standing in a line, boys and girls between 3 and 10 years old, posed stiffly in front of a brick wall. Their faces had that frozen look that was typical in old photos because of long camera times and Victorian stiffness. But one child was not like the others. The tiniest one, a girl around 3 years old, stood at the far left. Her face looked odd. So did how she was positioned. While the other children kept their heads up straight and stared at the camera, her head leaned slightly to one side, with her eyes shut. Margaret examined it more carefully. Something felt wrong about how the picture was set up. The girl's arms hung too straight down her sides. Her body looked strangely rigid, almost like someone was supporting her. And then there was the light. The children were lit by what seemed like electric lamps. Behind them, everything looked dark and full of shadows. Margaret was familiar with death photos. In Victorian days, taking pictures of dead people wasn't just acceptable, it was a meaningful way to honor them. In a time when 1 out of 5 children didn't live past age 5, when deadly diseases like scarlet fever, diphtheria, and measles hunted through nurseries like quiet killers, death was always nearby. For many families, especially poor ones, a photograph was impossible to afford unless death arrived. Then, suddenly, parents would gather their last pennies for one final picture, knowing it would be the only photo they would ever own of their precious child. Parents often paid photographers to capture one last image of a child who had passed away, making them appear as if they were simply resting or even still living, usually with their surviving brothers and sisters close by. The photographers had become experts at their sad work, brushing pink color onto white cheeks, adding lifelike shades to cold lips, and most eerily, painting open eyes onto closed eyelids to keep up the pretense that death was just sleep. She had looked at many of these pictures, but this one troubled her. Not because the girl might be dead, that was unfortunately typical back then, but because of how thoughtfully arranged the picture appeared. Carefully organized, shot in private. She sent the photo to the museum's laboratory for better scanning, simply hoping to record and save it. What returned shocked Margaret beyond belief. The improved image revealed tiny details that were invisible before. The girl's dress was flawless but too large, like it had been borrowed. Her shoes were mismatched, and beneath her left wrist, barely noticeable, was the outline of a thin metal support, the type typically used to prop up a dead person's head during the lengthy time required to capture a photograph. But there was something else that made Margaret's blood freeze. Around the girl's shut eyelids, she could make out the slightest hints of paint-a-typical Victorian method where photographers would brush open eyes onto the closed lids of the dead to create the appearance of life. And then Margaret spotted the most disturbing detail of all. While the other children looked slightly fuzzy from the normal movement that comes with being alive, the smallest girl was perfectly, strangely clear and focused. The obvious sign that she had stayed completely motionless during the picture-taking because she was already gone. It was becoming obvious this was a death photo. The youngest child, likely Mary Whitman, according to the writing, had been dead when the picture was captured. Even so, that wasn't weird by itself. What was odd was the timing and location. Why, Margaret puzzled, would a family set up such a delicate photograph without the typical mourning decorations or funeral flowers? Most death pictures, even private ones, were handled more quietly. Since memorial photos were so common, it seemed strange that there appeared to be some embarrassment about Mary Whitman's death, as if the family was attempting to conceal something. To find out more, Margaret began with the names. Whitman, Whitechapel, 1,901. A fast search of the 1,901 UK population records found a matching family. Thomas and Catherine Whitman, with 5 children recorded: William, Elizabeth, Frederick, Charles, and Mary. Their home, 42 Dorset Street, Whitechapel. Then she found something that made her straighten up. Mary Whitman was recorded in a burial list from March 6, 1901. Her reason for death: scarlet fever. The photograph, based on the faded mark on the back, had been captured on March 5, just one day earlier. Margaret caught her breath. The photograph hadn't been taken to honor Mary. It had been taken while she was recently dead or dying. This idea was even more unsettling than any other death picture she had ever encountered. She reached out to Dr. Francis Galton, a forensic historian at the University of London, to help verify the timeline and study the scanned image more closely. Galton had studied Victorian photographs before, and he grasped it right away. "This setup is very intentional," he said, pointing to where the other children were positioned. "Look at how they're each turned slightly away from her. Their feet aim outward, their shoulders tilt to the right. None of them are making contact with her." He pointed once more, this time at their hands. "See how they're concealed, crossed behind their backs, or hanging stiffly at their sides. That's not just Victorian politeness, that's uneasiness." Then Galton's voice fell to almost a whisper as he made the most frightening observation of all. "Look at the sharpness, Margaret. Really examine it. The living children, see how they're slightly blurred at the edges? But her." He stopped, his finger floating over the smallest figure. "She's perfectly crisp. Unnaturally so. The dead don't shift, Margaret. They never shift." In the picture, it was now obvious that Mary wasn't being supported or hugged. She stood by herself, slightly apart. The other children were living. She was not. In many other death pictures Margaret had viewed, the dead person was often held, embraced, or placed very near to the living family members. It was almost like the other Whitman children felt repulsed by their sister. Margaret could partly understand it was probably a very bewildering time for the young Whitmans. But in Victorian times, children typically followed their parents without arguing. Why hadn't Thomas and Catherine forced the children to stand closer together? Margaret couldn't stop feeling worried. It was almost like the photo had been hurried. It missed the grief and feeling that she'd noticed in other similar photographs. But the place kept bothering Margaret as well. She looked through local records for any mention of photographers working in Whitechapel in 1901 and discovered a listing in a business guide. H. Baden and Associates, Mortuary Photography Services, working briefly between 1897 and 1901, then shut down. She had heard Baden's name before. It showed up in a single court document from 1902 about a licensing problem. No official charges were brought, but the complaint was peculiar. An unnamed person had accused Baden of making false photographic proof for private customers in matters of wills and inheritance. The accusation went nowhere. No specifics were written down. But now Margaret questioned, was this more than just a mourning photograph? Sorry for the interruption. Before we continue with the story, I kindly ask you to like the video and subscribe to this channel. It is very important for us, thank you very much." Back at the museum, she asked to see the original donation files from the Acton collection. Dr. William Acton, who had owned the photo album, had been a doctor. His old patient records were part of the donation, mostly full of medicine orders and notes from home visits. But one entry, dated March 4th, 1901, caught her attention. Whitman family visit. Mary Whitman, 3 years old, high fever, skin rash, probably scarlet fever, death expected, family informed. No death record until told otherwise. And below, written faintly, agreement made with H. Baden. Private photo to be taken before official paperwork. Margaret sat quietly. This wasn't just a death photo. This was an intentional delay, a family working with a doctor and a photographer to put off the official recording of a child's death long enough to take a picture that would make it look like she was still alive. But why? She didn't have the answer yet. But she knew now that this picture wasn't what it seemed to be. The idea that started forming wasn't about sick fascination, but about motives. Why would a grieving family delay officially recording their daughter's death? Why photograph her after death so carefully, surrounded by her brothers and sisters, at night in a private backyard? Margaret and Dr. Galton's team looked up inheritance records from 1901 and found something surprising. Just weeks after Mary Whitman's recorded death date, a small inheritance had been processed from the estate of Mr. Henry Whitman, Thomas Whitman's father. His will was straightforward. 150 to be split equally among Thomas's children, as long as they were alive when it was given out. If a child died, their share would go back to the estate and be handled by an executor, a cousin in Shropshire. Margaret felt understanding wash over her slowly. This was about money. A family that should have been grieving their youngest child was instead driven by greed. Back then, 150 would have been a lot of money. For a working-class family struggling in the slums of Whitechapel, it would have been life-changing enough to escape poverty, maybe forever. But Margaret still couldn't understand the cold planning behind it all. Time would have been working against them in more ways than one. In the March cold, with no way to keep bodies fresh, decay would begin within hours. The photographer would have had to work fast, racing against the natural changes that death brings to a small body. Mary had died on March 4th, but the inheritance was supposed to be given out on March 6th. The photograph had been taken on March 5th, almost certainly to serve as proof that Mary was still alive the day before the money was legally divided. There would have been no time for paperwork, no legal battle, no doctors, no long investigation. The Whitmans needed only one thing to avoid suspicion and secure the full inheritance: a single dated image of all 5 children together, a piece of visual proof to suggest Mary had still been alive when the money was legally split. This would explain why Dr. Acton delayed filing the death certificate, why Baden was called in secretly, why the session was held after dark and not in a professional studio but in the family's own backyard. It was a planned act. The fact that a family could be so calculating while their children were probably confused and heartbroken sent chills down Margaret's spine. Dr. Galton noted the language in the inheritance documents. The clause doesn't require medical certification. He explained, only satisfactory proof of each beneficiary's survival on or around the release date. Without official death records, which wouldn't appear for several days, a posed photograph could serve as believable evidence, especially if no one asked questions. And back then, no one was going to examine a photo of 5 children as closely as Margaret was examining now. People might not have asked questions back then, but she had questions now. Margaret returned to the photograph once more. With the new information in mind, she looked again at each child's posture. She noticed something she hadn't seen before: the expressions. Mary's siblings weren't grieving. They were tense. William, the oldest, stood with his mouth pressed into a tight line, staring not at the camera, but just beside it. Elizabeth, turned slightly away, had her hands clasped so tightly they left faint marks in her gloves. The younger boys, Frederick and Charles, avoided her completely, their bodies angled away, their feet pointing in opposite directions. This wasn't a moment of mourning. It was something the children had been told to do, probably against their understanding or wishes. Stand still. Don't talk. Keep your distance. They hadn't disobeyed Thomas and Catherine at all. They had done exactly what they'd been told. Don't ask questions and don't talk about Mary to anyone. When Dr. Galton's team digitally enhanced the image one final time, one last detail came into focus, almost too faint to notice at first. At the bottom of Mary's left sleeve, near her wrist, there was a small pale tag sewn into the fabric. Zoomed in, it showed a series of hand-stitched initials, A.F., not Mary Whitman. Mary's full name was Mary Jane Whitman. Margaret's voice caught in her throat. "Foster?" she said. There was only one other person in this whole mystery whose last name started with F, Annie Foster. Margaret tested the name, but she didn't want to believe it. She and Galton rushed back to the Acton collection files. A few pages earlier in the doctor's old records, they found it. An entry from February 1901. Annie Foster, 4 years old, chest congestion, losing weight, treatment given, poor outlook. Mother, Sarah, unmarried, domestic worker. No further notes, no death recorded. Annie Foster had died, possibly in late February, and Dr. Acton had never filed her death certificate. There had been no funeral record, no baptism or burial in the parish records. It was as if she had disappeared. And now it seemed she had reappeared, dressed in borrowed clothes, posed with a different family. For a moment, Margaret said nothing. What this meant was chilling not because it was evil, but because it was so very practical. Dr. Acton, married but not to anyone named Sarah and apparently childless, had quietly buried his illegitimate daughter, probably without his wife ever knowing about the affair. He had also, by chance or design, become the trusted family doctor of the Whitmans. When their youngest daughter, Mary Whitman, died days before an inheritance release, the opportunity was there. No one outside the family knew either girl well. The names were even similar. The child in the photograph might not be Mary Whitman at all. She might be Annie Foster, posed to pretend to be the Whitman's daughter just long enough to capture an image. The family's real daughter was already dead. Annie Foster, already deceased, had her body used for a single photo that would serve a single legal purpose. This would explain the borrowed dress, the wrong initials, and why no one in the image is physically touching the girl. Dr. Acton had taken his only chance to have a photograph of his daughter, overcome by his own emotions. In a world where infant mortality claimed 1 in 5 children before their 5th birthday, where a photograph was often the only keepsake a parent could afford of their lost child, he had seized this morbid opportunity. He'd manipulated the Whitmans in their grief to go along with his plan, and he'd stay quiet about the inheritance if they stayed quiet about Mary. It was a devil's bargain, born of desperation and paternal love, twisted by circumstance. Margaret wrote in her report, "The photograph, long believed to be a conventional post-mortem family portrait, instead reveals a far more complex deception, one in which a grieving family may have substituted a body in order to secure an inheritance." When the story was published in the Journal of Victorian Material Culture, it caused a media storm. It offered a glimpse into the blurred lines of grief, desperation, and legal gray areas in a time when children died frequently, and photographic images had a kind of legal weight no longer imagined today. Margaret never gave interviews. She declined television requests, stayed off social media, and never claimed moral outrage. In her private notes, she wrote, The question we must ask isn't who lied, it's who had no other choice. The photo would forever stand out as one of the most shocking death portraits she'd ever seen. It questioned the decisions people made when overwhelmed by grief. And when money could offer something life-changing, if someone you loved had done something like this, not out of evil but desperation, would you see it as fraud or something more human? Did you like the story? Would you tell a lie if it meant protecting your family from poverty? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this tale, don't forget to subscribe and give it a thumbs up. Desperation can push people to take actions they never imagined possible. Thanks for tuning in, see you in the next video, and have a wonderful day.